Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's FIW Trade Talks on the topic Economic Policy Making in the 21st Century with Dr. Adam Posen. The Trade Talks are generously supported by the Austrian Federal Ministry of Labor and the Economy, and we are very grateful for this financial support. My name is Harald Oberhofer. I'm your host today, and before I introduce our guest for this Trade Talk, let me just briefly walk you through the housekeeping rules for the FIW Trade Talks. For all of you that already participated in some of these talks, you might know how this works, but for our newcomers, here is just the brief rules that we have. So the Trade Talk is organized as follows. We will start with a 10 to 15 minutes input presentation by Adam Posen on the topic of economic policy making in the 21st century. And this is then followed by 40-45 minutes Q&As and a discussion between Adam and myself. And you can also actively participate in this discussion by posting your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom. You find the button below there. The webinar will also be recorded and posted online at the FIW homepage after the seminar. Furthermore, after the seminar, you will receive a short feedback questionnaire, and we would be very happy if you could take a few minutes and get us some feedback. We always want to improve on our format, so we would be very helpful for any type of feedback. Now, but now it's time to introduce our guests. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Adam Posen to the FIW Trade Talks. Thank you very much, Adam, for being with us today. Adam S. Posen is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics since January 2013. He's very well known all over the world. He has contributed to research and public policy regarding basically everything that is important in an international context, so monetary and fiscal policies within the G20, the challenges the European integration is facing, especially since the adoption of the euro. He did a lot of recent work on China-US relationships, and he developed new approaches to financial recovery and stability. I also want to mention one specific point. I could go on and go on and go on, but I want to mention one specific point. Adam also co-authored a book that is entitled Inflation Targeting: Lessons from the International Experience. And this is co-authored with, among others, Ben Bernanke, who has been announced just yesterday to be one of the Nobel laureates in economics for this year in 2022. He's also very active in public policy debates. So Adam published opinion pieces and has been quoted in leading newspapers and policy publications. Just to mention a few: Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and many, many more. Adam holds both a BA and a PhD from the Harvard University. But without any further delay, Adam, thank you very much again for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Harold. It's a very generous introduction, and I'm very proud, I guess, to be riding on Ben Bernanke's coattails a good 24 years after we wrote our book. Very deserving, obviously, Nobelist. But I'm very grateful to be invited by FIW Trade Talks and Professor Oberhofer today. This is an important venue for discussing the economic affairs, and I particularly have long admired the active economic and academic culture in Wien and Austria more broadly. So I'm grateful to be engaging with you all. I chose not to put together slides because generally my rule is, if I'm doing a 15-minute or lower duration talk, not to use slides. I hope everyone understands there's plenty of material for me and colleagues on the Peterson Institute website, which I will refer to in this talk. Again, final bit of boilerplate. While I'm drawing on inputs from my many colleagues at Peterson, This is all just my opinion, my views. So I think when we talk about the 21st century world of policy making, there's two defining characteristics and a third that is misleadingly seen as defining. So the first of the two characteristics, which is where I'm going to really start my talk, is the long-term, not short-term, long-term ongoing withdrawal of the US from economic globalization and the interaction of this with the growing China-US, and one could argue Western democracies, and with China. And I think that shapes not everything, but importantly shapes a very great deal of public policy making. This is, of course, to some degree a Washington centered point of view, but unfortunately, once we get national security issues involved, which obviously, given Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine and China's aggression in certain areas geographically, then the US role becomes outsized, the US government role. And I mentioned Chinese aggression. I just want to assure listeners that I'm probably closer to the European view on China than the American view. Certainly the American government view, but we have to sort of acknowledge the aggressive aspects up front. The second defining characteristic of economic policy making in the 21st century, at least the first half, is climate change and climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. We have just started work on this at the Peterson Institute, led by my colleague Jean Pisani-Ferry, on the macroeconomics of the green transition. I held off on us doing much work up to now because I just frankly didn't really see the point when so many governments were in denial, including the US. But now that all governments essentially have made commitments to some target by some fixed date, it's more reasonable to think about how we move on that front. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about relate to how we can move together on climate change, but they're not going to directly talk about climate change per se. The third point that some people raise as a defining characteristic of 21st century policymaking, where I disagree, is the issue of populism, particularly right-wing populism. And there's a tendency to ascribe the rise of right-wing populism primarily to economic dislocation. I'd rather not go into this up front. I'm happy to take questions about it or get into a discussion of it, but just to say, I don't view political outcomes as that economically determined. If anything, the evidence is in most of the European and American and Anglophone democracies, economic factors are of diminishing importance to people's votes. They are much more driven by identity and ideology than economic factors. Now, there's something of a chicken and egg question here. My own view, which is not just a gut feeling based on a lot of different people's research, is on the extreme end of saying people blame economics, people blame globalization for the populist wave, but I think other things are at work. And part of that is the cross-sectional differences. We saw some, from my point of view, positive developments recently in Austrian politics. You don't have to end up looking like the US or the UK, even if you are in this global economy. So those are the three or two and one negative views on what defines 21st century economic policymaking. So now let me turn to spelling out what I mean by US withdrawal, China-US conflict, and then take that into some specific policy realms. So the first point is globalization is a multi-layered process. It is, and it's not one process, it's a condition. And I've spoken and written in the past talking about the corrosion of globalization. And I don't want to mince words that much, but I think it's an important distinction. People talk about the end of globalization, the rollback of globalization. I think people who do that are overly focused on trade, whereas globalization, again, it's multi-layer. There's flows of information, of capital, of human capital, meaning people, business networks, intellectual networks, ideas, hot money financing, long-term financing, trade and services as well as goods. There's an awful lot that goes into these relationships, and they don't perfectly correlate at all times. And similarly, geographically, globalization, meaning deeper economic integration across national borders, can be advancing in some places, as it is right now in Southeast Asia, for example, as it in fits and starts is in Southeastern Europe and around the Med, even at the same time that I would suggest or argue that the US is deliberately withdrawn. So globalization is not a one-all, 0-1, is trade going on or expanding or not. But in that context, the US issues become even more stark. So there is a tendency to think of Trump and Biden as a backlash to some combination. Trump and Biden's economic policies, let me be clear, of largely anti-trade, as a backlash to globalization, exacerbated or accelerated by China and by COVID. But if you look at the data, the US withdrawal from globalization starts at least 20 years ago, and on some measures, arguably in the mid-90s. So well before China was perceived as or became a major source of economic dislocation. The US has been steadily reducing its openness to immigrants for 25 years, basically since the NAFTA agreement was signed and officially went into force in 1995. The US has been in fits and starts, but in a ratchet, been increasing its restrictions on foreign direct investment in the US, and has considered and now is about to see a proposal for very large new restrictions on outward foreign direct investment by US companies. The trade, obviously, since the Korea-US bilateral trade deal, which is now almost 20 years old, has not made any new trade deals of any significance, and withdrew very visibly from being part of what's now CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which it founded, and of course dropped any efforts at US-EU trade deals. In the regulatory sphere, it's more mixed. There are some areas where the US has withdrawn and some areas where the US has collaborated. Interestingly, financial services regulation is one of the areas where we've seen most successful collaboration, and there are some cross borders, and there's some interesting political economy questions about why that should be the case. But just to say that the starting point I want everyone to have is the direction of travel of the US government across multiple administrations of both parties in the US has been against globalization. It's not Trump or Biden is a blip. And this has important effects on policymaking for the rest of the world. Additionally, we of course have seen a major shift in Chinese behavior, both in terms of external relations and economic policies, external and internal, since party chairman, party general secretary, and President Xi took office. I mean, basically, he takes office in 2012. 2013 is sort of the peak point for external observers saying, oh, maybe there's going to be reform. And since then, it's all gone the other way, pretty much. All right, so that to me is the overwhelming backdrop along with climate change for international or economic policymaking. So where do we go from there? What does this mean in practice? Let me try to give a reasonably decent sized list that isn't pretending to be comprehensive. The main point is that the major institutions, whether you define them as actual functioning organizations like the IMF or the WTO, or the rules of the road in terms of norms of economic behavior, these have basically eroded across a wide range of issues. It doesn't mean that you can't do trade, you can't have migration, you can't have discussions about how to regulate it, but the application of any results of those discussions, past or present, is much more spotty and politicized. It's much more about the bidding wars we see from the US versus China in, be it the Solomon Islands just recently, or Argentina a couple of years ago. And therefore, the uniformity of application of norms and rules is much less than it once was. Now, there are many things in which I've had to become more awakened and reconsider in recent years, but I never was blind to the fact that the US was always had security motivations and was self-dealing in various ways. But I think it's pretty well established empirically that from the 50s through the early 90s, the US on balance was allowing the system to work, and on balance was mostly enforcing uniformity, particularly to the benefit of middle-income countries who could take advantage of it, notably the fast-growing economies of East Asia, to include China and Mexico, and to some degree Eastern Europe. And that for the last 20 plus years, this fair dealing and sort of enabling of trade expansion has expired or reduced. Now, my colleague Arvind Subramanian and various co-authors, and also another colleague of mine, Robert Lawrence at Peterson, have both written about issues of what are called premature de-industrialization. So what happens if in India focuses on call centers and IT support rather than doing what was the traditional ladder up, industrializing, say, moving from textiles to small electronic assembly and so on. And that literature documents that it's not just US, but there's a general issue of rich countries, or I should say higher income countries, pulling up the ladder after them in a way that hadn't been true before. So one aspect of this, which we're seeing right now, is the issue of how can developing countries make the leap? How can individual businesses and individual people in developing countries make the leap in this context? And I think what has happened is not uncommon, but sadly sensible, which is we're starting to see a further tiering, T-I-E-R. I forget how to say that auf Deutsch, but anyway, division into levels of the way the lower income, low and middle income economies are going. The large, low and middle income economies, the Brazils, Indias, Mexicos, Poland's, Turkey is a bit of an exception, but Turkey, Indonesia, you know, basically the G20 plus a little bit developing economies, they're actually doing reasonably well. And we see this of late, that despite all the concern over Fed tightening and its spillovers on others, that actually their policies, again, with notable exception of Turkey, their macro policies across this wide range of countries were quite solid, got out in front of Fed policies in some ways, and they have suffered less, far less in this cycle than they did in the past, or than countries not as large and well off. And so I fear that part of policymaking is going to be about managing this two-track or multiple-tier system in which the large emerging markets, particularly those with geographic ties to one of the main economies, US, EU, China, will be in much better shape, even if not great shape, than what happens in the lower middle income economies. Another issue, of course, is the extreme rise in the dollar. There is a tendency in Washington, I am sad to report, you know, to view this as a great vindication, and that, US is a sanctioned superpower and can do this, that, and the other, and people will just crowd in. I think that's much too simple-minded and self-congratulatory, and I'm sure that view does not surprise people in Austria and beyond. You know, Russia invading Ukraine is a special case in some sense, in the extent to which there is widespread support. One can think of Singapore and Switzerland, two countries that almost never join sanctions except when they are completely multilateral, meaning a UN Security Council resolution, basically immediately volunteering to join the sanctions in the current context. I'm not sure that's likely to be repeated. In fact, I genuinely doubt it's likely to be repeated. And then, of course, we have issues going back to climate of global public goods provision. And, you know, there is a tendency for people in my or Professor Oberhofer's position to not always want to go back to the same old ideas because we'd like to be creative and get points for being new and do something original. But we really are back to some very basic ideas of collective action problems, and particularly when there's distrust for exogenous but real reasons. You know, my colleague Chad Bown, in particular, Peterson, among others, also Monica DeBola, Maury Obstfeld, have tried to look at the issues of vaccine provision, and we tried to help with that in real time. And we had, you know, the Gavi Alliance, and we had various pledges by different leadership groups, but the failure to share and provide the vaccines and the medical equipment in the first year of the pandemic is extremely striking. And especially since it is not a first order distributional issue the way, say, trade is, or the way migration is unfairly perceived to be. I mean, nobody gets hurt in the US or Germany by Africans having vaccines. In fact, people get hurt in the US and Germany by Africans not having vaccines. And so the fact that we could not get to some kind of faster collective action of more generosity and delivery on medical equipment and vaccines is a very big warning going ahead for global warming. So let me conclude, it's not all bleak. The possibility of plurilateral systems, meaning groups of countries, not bilateral, but not multilateral, leading the way, particularly on climate, I think remains high. I assume everyone on this event is well familiar with Bill Nordhaus and his idea of climate clubs, and effectively, I certainly am relying on the EU to occasionally whack the US upside the head and to lead with its climate pricing and potentially with carbon border adjustments. I see in the trade sphere as well as in green investment, exciting things happening in ASEAN and with Japan and the Asian Development Bank. And for that matter, the somewhat independent AIIB based in Beijing to get past coal, to fund better projects, to improve the grid. There is space here, but it's just all going to be a lot less consistent, a lot less done at the multilateral level, and it's going to have to be done by countries, including Austria. And I know this isn't why you called me, but I'm a very big believer that the EU and individual, let's call them third countries, have space and need to stand up to the US and China on some of these economic and climate issues. So maybe I can stop there.
Thank you very much, Adam. Really, thank you very much for this broad overview. And I think we have a lot of issues to talk about here. So maybe I would start first with some questions on your two or three important observations, and then in the second part of the discussion move to the implications. Before doing so, just a reminder to the audience, please participate in our discussion by posting your questions into the Q&A section here in Zoom. But maybe let me just start first with your first observation on the long-term ongoing withdrawal of the US from globalization. For an economist, there is still one question open on that. Why are they doing that? If our theory is right, then we could all profit from globalization. I would also agree with you that the broader definition of globalization is much more valuable than just looking at trade and then within trade on specific goods where we have specific tariffs and so on and so forth. So the question still will be, what is the economic rationale for doing that?
I just let me recap the facts a moment, Harold, before I try to give you a rationale. So we have updated charts of this on the Peterson Institute website. And, so take, for example, the rough and ready measure of exports plus imports as a share of GDP, which some academics like Gene Grossman think is a distortion. But anyway, as a first approximation of openness. And average openness across the world is rising. It's on a very steeply rising path. And as noted by Richard Baldwin, Carolyn Freund, and others, Penny Goldberg, there is no, even with the interruption, as it were, of the global financial crisis, even with COVID and the concerns about supply chains, basically the share of trade in world GDP, the average share of trade in the average economy, the share of trade in the vast majority of economies, if you plot individual economies, is steeply rising. Even economies that in the rich world, the high income world that we're seen as relatively close, like Japan and Australia, they're increasing this. And the US is basically flat across this whole period. And so it stands out like a sore thumb. It's not even just what you say on first principles. There's gains to be had, which is very real, but that the US seems to have not gotten the memo that other economies, including China, have gotten. I don't have a simple answer. I have some speculative political economy answers. I view this as part of the same ideology that leads to underutilization of human capital, meaning institutionalized racism against people of color, which means we don't use their talents and don't employ them in the ways we should, which leads to the declining growth in our immigrant population. So our immigrant population is still growing, but it's growing, I believe, at a less than a fourth and roughly a fifth the rate it was 20 years ago. And so, and the US stands out on all these measures pretty much. You have Brexit and a sudden switch by the UK, but even that is primarily in the trade and foreign direct investment field. Immigration is still relatively open. So I don't have a good answer, but I think it has to be seen as part of, in some sense, this right-wing nationalist identity kind of thinking, and then partly the nature and the breakdown of the US political process. That you get people in Congress who do not necessarily represent large parts of the American electorate and do not necessarily vote their interests as opposed to small, well-organized special interests. And again, this is all classical, boring political economy, but in the US, we seem to have gotten a pretty extreme point on that spectrum.
Thanks. But that's actually, I find that this one very interesting, because in some sense, when you talk about political economy, then we somehow maybe naturally come to the point talking about populism. And here I'm always a bit surprised if people say that that policymakers are not doing good jobs, and just your characterization of the US system, then in my point of view, the natural question would arise, why aren't those political parties or political leaders just voted out of office if they are just doing policies that are costly to the economy, costly to the people in the economy? and maybe without bringing huge benefits. And that's why I thought it could maybe be related to populism somehow.
Yeah, no, I think it is, but again, there's a lot of back and forth about this. But part of it is just, again, how much chicken, how much egg.
Right.
So one thing that's very apparent in the polling data, which I think is true for a lot of democratic countries, but particularly true in the US, is perceptions of the economy have grown more subject to partisanship and less tied to reality. So if you go back more than 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years, where we have reasonably consistent public opinion polling data, you can go back to the 60s, basically. And the predictive power of economic outcomes for elections has been going down. It's still there. But essentially, if you do it on a rolling coefficients basis, the coefficients are shrinking over time. At the same time, if you're predicting, if your dependent variable isn't vote, it's perception of how well the economy is doing. Basically, whether your party is in or out of office has become increasingly important. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think, I think through the 70s into the early 80s, I think basically through the Volcker disinflation in the mid 80s, your partisanship really didn't affect very much how you perceive the economy. Whereas basically since, again, depending how you parse the data, but since the global financial crisis, in the US, it's radically changed. And you see the same thing with discussions of Putin or discussions of various issues, that it just, which party identification you have totally colors your view of the economy. And so all I can do is just state this as a fact right now. Putting it differently, Al Gore should have won in 2000, not because the Supreme Court should have ruled the other way, but from a formal forecasting point of view. If you plugged in what the economic situation was and the lack of war was into the established economic models or econometric models of voter, Gore should have won by a large amount. And that's continued to be the case, that Trump should have lost by a much larger amount than he did, if you relied on the economic models.
Great, thank you. We already have 5 questions now. Just the last question from my side before I'm moving to the questions from the audience, and then I will maybe use a different ordering depending on how the questions fit in where we are in the discussion. Would be just related again to this first argument of the withdrawal of the US. What would be your standpoint or viewpoint on the implication of this for the WTO, right? Because again, from an economic point of view, we would always argue that multilateral trade policy or general policy governing globalization would be most effective and most beneficial. And so if one of the key players is not interested in anymore in globalization, so this is already hurting WTO a lot, right? Since years, and if your outlook for the long-term future goes like that, then is there any future for the WTO?
I think there is, and I'm a very big fan of the current Director General Ngozi and some of her leadership team, because they've not accepted being written off. They've not just sort of passively sat there. But I do think the main feature for the WTO will be more about keeping the current system operating and less about creating new multilateral trade rounds. So we look at the fact that dispute settlement, for example, got bollocksed up because the US government decided to complain a lot about it under Trump and continued to do so under Biden. Dispute settlement's really useful. And so very quickly, not without some effort, but very quickly, we had essentially an N-1 dispute settlement system set up where, and I thank my colleague, the former EU Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, for playing a leading role in this, that you could, if you were not the US, you could take things to dispute settlement and get it done. Similarly, you can have some rules that are in place for if CPTPP expands in terms of membership, what are the accession rules versus RCEP versus. I think there's a lot of useful things the WTO can do, but the idea of these multilateral large-scale trade rounds, I think, unfortunately, is just not on, as the British would say. And the other thing is, again, it just echoes the previous thing, and I'm sorry to be out here talking to a foreign audience, a non-US audience about US problems, and I get a lot of hatred on the internet sometimes when I do that. But the fact is, as my colleague Jeff Schott and others at Peterson have documented, the US would win a disproportionate amount of its WTO cases, either when it brought cases against others or China or others brought cases against the US. And so this idea that somehow got very popular in Washington, that the WTO was this biased, terrible system, is just wrong, but it's still there.
Thanks. So we're getting more and more questions, and I have one that is, I think, closely related to my question on WTO by Julia. She's asking, when you're talking about stepping up against moves of some big economies, do you think of doing so within the existing institutional frameworks, or do you think that a major change in the institutional setup is unavoidable, or violating these rules is unavoidable to do so? For example, again, as I said, WTO or international,
Right.
Thinking of the consensus of WTO or the most favored nation clause.
I think it's a very astute question. So my view is it's kind of both. That the primary issue is for places like the EU and some other countries, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Korea, market-friendly democracies, to push ahead where they can and kind of force the US to keep up. And so I already mentioned the example of the EU potentially becoming a climate club and putting on some kind of border adjustment mechanism. There's issues about how compatible with WTO that is. But anyway, some kind of mechanism that says we're going for greener and we're not going to let you dump dirty industry products into our system. But even when there's not enforcements per se, like with a border adjustment mechanism, I think there's space for third countries to create higher standards, and that forces the US into action through public opinion, through peer pressure, and so on. It's not 100% reliable by any means, but I think it's a useful direction to go in. So, make the deals, the high quality deals you can, whether it's in trade or international regulation or climate border adjustments or what. But I also think it's standing up to the US when the US government tries to force somebody to choose between China and the US. I think it may or may not be reasonable. I think it's arguably reasonable, but certainly it's unavoidable that if the US says the following technologies are militarily important, we don't want you. I keep saying the US when I mean the US government, just to be clear, not the US people or the US nation in some sense. But anyway, says certain military use technologies, we don't want you to ship to China, and if you do, bad things will happen. The US is going to overdo that, and there's room for Europe and Japan and others to push back and say, don't define military useful incredibly broadly. But at some point, that's going to happen, and you have to accept it. But there are a bunch of other things, and we saw the Solomon Islands of all people stand up and say very publicly, we don't want to choose, don't make us choose in economic terms. Similarly, we had the finance minister and deputy prime minister of Singapore, Lawrence Wong, speak at the Institute about 6 months ago during the spring IMF meetings. And he gave a very public statement about Singapore not wanting to choose. And I think it is fair and right to do that. In terms of the new institutions, I don't want to get too high concept here, but there are a lot of debates in political economy. To me, and this is represented very much by the WTO, you get the institutions once you have sort of the interests aligned and you agree on something. And then the institutions are there to operationalize, monitor, facilitate that agreement. So I would love to see some alterations to the multilateral institutions, particularly the World Bank and IMF, less so the WTO, having to do with voice of non-US, but also non-China voting shares, having to do with what the fund is allowed to get into and what they're not. But again, to me, the institutions follow agreements among the major powers, not you change the institutions to force change on others.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We're getting more and more questions. We have a lot of interest on your view on Europe before jumping to Europe. So crossing the sea. One more general question, which I find very interesting from Robert Stera, is about another maybe very important challenge that you have not yet talked about, and it's about demographic shifts ahead of us with China and EU rapidly aging. So we are seeing the rapidly aging populations, especially in China and EU. Robert says not so much in the US and well, in Africa and Latin America, rapidly rising. And the question would be, how would that affect long-term geoeconomics and geopolitics in your point of view?
Thank you, and I appreciate Mr. Stera raising it. I think all of us who are not following this every day were shocked when the latest UN population projections came out, and China is projected to have a worse than Italian, more like Korean, Japanese collapse in demographics. And you see post one-child policy, people in China, families not choosing to have more than one kid for the most part, despite a lot of moral suasion, as it were, from the state. So it's a real issue. There is a vast literature related to political science out there that others are better qualified to comment on, about when you have imbalances of young men, either in terms of longitudinally the share of young men in society, or cross-gender, that you have, for tragic reasons, many more men than women by usual standards in a given generation. How that affects aggressiveness in foreign policy, how that affects other things. I think, though, I tend to, in economic terms, play down the importance of demographics versus some other people. This is partly influenced by my experience being pretty engaged with Japan's economic performance for the last 25 years, and partly because at a welfare level, what we care about is individual well-being. So, per capita income in Japan has not done that badly. Quality of life in Japan has not done that badly. You could say the same thing in Italy, as much as it's held up as a horror story in Europe. Actually, quality of life for many people in Italy and per capita income's done okay. So, and then you look at Russia, which had the most acute demographic collapse of any place that I'm aware of outside of, pandemic and civil war zones, in the early days of the transition. You have about a 7-year sudden decline during the Yeltsin period of life expectancy for males, which is a huge number. So anyway, just to say, I don't view demographics as deterministic. There are a lot of people who tend to seem to think that that's all that matters in the long run. I'm not I don't find the evidence very compelling for that. I would put in two caveats. First is there is some interrelationship between demographics and long-term inflation and innovation that I at least did not fully appreciate. And again, looking at Japan and now China, one can see that somehow with an aging society, there is some decline in flexibility and innovativeness, which sounds like a usual simple-minded, just sort of, oh, these people are in trouble, but I think in reality matters. And the second thing is, as my new colleague Michael Clemens has argued, and many others, ultimately this all doesn't matter if you were willing to allow large-scale migration. Politically, of course, it's impossible right now. Germany did its best, Austria and others have done their best in the last 5-10 years, but the potential gains to human welfare from allowing large-scale migration essentially dwarf anything else we have control over right now. So I'm worried I'm not giving a tight answer to the question, but it's just I see whatever the issues in demographics, I see a very easy fix, but a fix that we're unwilling to take, and so then I sort of throw up my hands.
Thanks. Okay, I think we now, so there's a lot of interest on your views in Europe, also from the political side, but maybe first start with this globalization story and more like trade policy in a more narrow sense. So I have two questions here, which I think we can combine. Is from Manfred Schicklin and from Barbara Koda-Krajniak. They're both basically asking that your main first point that you mentioned is that the US is withdrawing from globalization, and they somehow think, well, isn't it that also true for the EU? So aren't we in Europe emulating the American withdrawal from the globalization? So trade policy is seen as an extension of industrial policy. Trade agreements are unpopular. Trade defense measures are popular. So what advice would you give to European politicians in this regard? And the second question is even more specific on these defensive measures. So about the European Commission's proposal on anti-coercion instrument, which is currently under discussion. So whether you would consider this as a counterproductive to positive economic and political relationships between the EU and any third country. Wow,
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, no. So let me try. So if you just look at the broad numbers, both levels and trends, the vast majority of EU economies are continuing to open up. Again, you have to smooth out COVID and various things, but you don't see retreats on trade, retreats on immigration. Again, I don't make a thing of there was the huge surge in, was it 2016, and then it fell off that. I'm talking about multi-year averages. There really is a stark contrast to the US, both in terms of level and direction, in terms of various measures of globalization. I think where we are seeing globalization meant as openness to economic integration with the rest of the world. And if anything, in certain areas that sometimes get labeled soft power, but R&D, joint R&D spending, green technology promotion, opening of new regional free trade agreements. The EU is actually continuing to open up. So an interesting issue, which is raised by the questioners about the linkages with industrial policy, I think is a real issue. Everybody's moving in that direction. COVID, I think, radically increased the legitimate and the illegitimate use of resilience as a justification for industrial policy. And then you throw in the security concerns vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia. So there's a lot going on in the industrial policy space, and that's true. And it is quite subject to being abused, turned into nationalist policy, turned into subsidies for incumbents. So I'm watching that space. I think that is important. But even with that, mostly industrial policy is about throwing away a lot of money and to some degree entrenching local incumbents, both of which are not good, but which are not sort of cosmic either. These are what I call literally second order, meaning they're not the most important things in the world, but they matter.
Yeah, thank you a lot. We still have many questions, but only a few minutes of time. And so I would now like to, so that we at least have some minutes to talk about climate change and climate change mitigation policies. And we also have some questions in this regard. And this is also related to the relationship of the EU with US. And so the first question would be, so I'm again collecting some parts together because I think they are somehow related. So one question is, how realistic are hopes for a climate club, including the EU and the US? And whether you think about the EU carbon border tax, CPAM, would this lead to carbon clubs? So would this be a good policy tool for inducing such clubs? And then the third question related to this one, I think is also a very important one when we talk about global public goods and this collective action problem that we are facing. The third question is about the third world countries, so global south economies, and the question is whether they can really afford to look at carbon pricing, or shouldn't they have the priority for poverty reduction and zero hunger goals first?
Again, I appreciate your grouping things together, and it makes sense, but it makes it a little overwhelming. So let me try to fixate on that. So I think we have to recognize, and I'm by no means an expert in this, but by reading and listening to experts, that the vast bulk of dealing with carbon and reducing carbon consumption, carbon creation and consumption, is domestic. It's not international, and it's not about trade and steel. It's about how you power your grid. It's about how you power your homes. It's about the materials you use in building your homes. It's about how much you rely on the internal combustion engine versus other forms for transport. It's a lot of things that have to do with domestic regulation. As usual, there's just too much emphasis on manufacturing because people envision things that way. But as we saw with the chlorofluorocarbons agreement decades ago, as we saw with the similar issues of conflict diamonds or treatment of the fisheries, there are ways in which doing things at the border can encourage broader, better behavior. Mm-hmm. And the biggest issue in climate, or what should be the biggest issue in climate policy, is this debate between what do you do if everybody's free riding on your changes versus how much do India and the rest of the global, so-called global south, deserve to get back some energy usage in return for all the carbon that the rich countries burned through in the last 300 years. That's the nub of the matter. I'm not telling you or your audience anything you don't know. But we're in a desperate situation right now. And so one has to try to move the public debate in binding ways. And so it has been useful that the EU has been focused on their tariff equivalents of their carbon price adjustments through time to put pressure on the US government, including the Biden administration, to do something that they will say is roughly equivalent. I will say it's not close, but at least it's in the right direction. So EU shows up and says, we have so much carbon dollars or euros per ton carbon tax. US, what do you got? And Biden administration says, we can't really do a carbon tax because then we'll lose every election from now till 2200. But look, if we subsidize the following green technologies and put in place regulations that reduce use of those technologies and get us on this path, here's a funny formula we can use to try to justify that what that is in carbon pricing terms. And I think that's a useful dynamic. As I've said, and going back to an earlier question, to me, part of where the EU, sorry, I had to deal with UK financial crisis this morning, so I keep misspeaking. EU is helpful is I don't know if the US would have done anything like that instead of just empty verbiage absent pressure from the EU. And part of the way the EU is helpful is making it public and setting a standard. And the real pressure isn't the EU saying, US, come on, you're awful. It's saying, we don't buy that particular calculation of equivalence to a carbon price. If you want to be serious, we need the following additional steps. Now, as I said, though, the big ticket issue is how much do the large economies, well, all the economies of the developing world, get a break from this? And the answer is they should get a very big break from this. There should be, I mean, again, this goes back to like you were saying, Harald, earlier with free trade. There should be a deal possible where for forgoing cheap coal, the developing world gets a huge boatload of money from the rich world, including assistance to come up with other sources of energy. Similarly to what goes on in Amazon deforestation, and other deforestation. That should be the deal. Politically, we're very far from there. And I have not yet come up with a neat way to harness plurilateral or bilateral agreements to get there. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's I would agree that this is the way forward in terms of policy making. And maybe just one related quick question on this one as our closing question. What do you think, or what in your view is the role of China in this regard with climate mitigation policies? So where would you locate China, and what would you demand from China in order, it's also a large economy. Basically, it's the largest economy in the world already. So we need China as well in the boat, right?
Yeah. So I obviously believe the facts as you put them, and I would love to see China be more constructive than it is. And I suppose the one good thing about having autocratic rule is if President Xi and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party were to get serious about climate, they can make a very big difference very quickly. But we've seen them in their Belt and Road and related lending, international lending, not doing very much in the way of putting on climate requirements. I guess they made a statement earlier this year that they would stop funding coal plants or other dirty plants, but it's not clear that's actually happening. They're exporting a lot of concrete and other embedded things of carbon. And China, unfortunately, and this is one of the big issues with the US and I think Europe, it likes to see itself and be treated in international organizations, as still a developing country, whereas it's not.
Yep.
And part of the resentment, not all, but part of the resentment from US and European and other Western officials is this, at best, two-way of having it, wanting more voice, but wanting to be a developing country. I think, but I just don't think the kinds of pressures I was talking about will work directly on China. So I'd rather have the EU and the rest of the civilized world, not to say China isn't civilized, but anyway, the rest of the Western democratic world, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, putting pressure on the US. And then if the US and EU and Japan, end up moving together, then that's a much better standpoint on which to put pressure on China.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. This hour flew again, so it passed very quickly. We're unfortunately now at the end of this FIW Trade Talk. As we always have the rule that we are only doing 60 minutes. I'm sorry that we could not pick up all the questions, but thanks again for putting them there, and thanks for everybody for this active participation in our discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And before concluding this trade talk, just very briefly, in a final announcement, we will have the next FIW Trade Talk with Professor Anna Bradford from Columbia University. She is Mrs. Brussels Effect, as I would call her, and we will have a trade talk on the Brussels Effect on December the 5th this year, again at 4 p.m. Central European time. So this is just an announcement. Of course, we will have our newsletter with this date as well in a few weeks to come. And with this, thanks again, Adam. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a good evening, Adam. Have a good day in Washington. Thank you very much once again, and all the best, and stay healthy, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, FIW. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Harald.